This presentation is about draft regulations that the Tasmanian government has released that will impact people who grow or eat berries, leafy vegetables, and/or melons. The presentation explains the background, the main features of these draft regulations, and how they will impact growers. The reason I'm making this presentation is to encourage people who eat and people who grow food to make a submission to the government's consultation. It's a very short time frame. The submissions are due by 5 p.m. on the 19th of December 2025. So who on earth am I? I'm not a representative of the government. I am a concerned citizen with some experience growing berries for sale, substantial experience reading and interpreting legislation and evaluating the implications of legal rules, and I have a passion for eating excellent locally grown food. I will be preparing my own submission on this consultation, but I really wanted to support other people to understand what the draft regulations say and to prepare and make their own submission. So, a little bit of background. The food standards applying to berries, leafy vegetables, and melons are national rules which were developed in 2023. And the draft regulations that are currently in the consultation process are the Tasmanian government's plan to implement those standards. Now, the berry, leafy vegetable, and melon standards were developed because some fresh produce, specifically berries, leafy vegetables, melons, and sprouts, has been associated with some foodborne disease outbreaks in Australia. One of the factors contributing to this is that consumers often demand ready-to-eat fresh produce, which they don't necessarily wash before they eat it, and this has increased the frequency of foodborne disease outbreaks. Investigations have revealed that sources of contamination include poor hygiene during the harvesting and processing processes, the presence of animal fecal matter, and/or contaminated water. So they are the risks that essentially need to be managed. State governments have agreed to adopt the standards for consistency and consumer protection and public health reasons. There are some commercial growers in Tasmania who want the standards to be implemented. The delay in Tasmania adopting the standards through its regulatory system has created a barrier for some Tasmanian producers who want to sell outside Tasmania. So for them, their customers are driving a need and an expectations that there should be regulations in Tasmania adopting these nationally agreed standards. So the Tasmanian regulations are made by exercise of power in the Primary Produce Safety Act 2011. So just to explain what regulations are, they're what we call subordinate legislation. So they're only valid to the extent that the Act grants power to develop those regulations. So the Act and the regulations interact a little bit. The objects of that Act are to provide for application of the Food Safety Code in Tasmania for primary production activities, to develop food safety schemes that reduce risks to consumers associated with unsafe or unsuitable primary produce, to promote consumer confidence in the safety and integrity of Tasmanian primary produce, and to facilitate the trade of Tasmanian primary produce by ensuring that it meets national and international food safety standards. There are already regulations in Tasmania in relation to other primary produce, specifically dairy, meat and poultry, seafood, eggs, seed sprouts, and pet food. So those regulations implement the relevant food safety standards applying to that produce. Something to note is that we don't really know how well those existing regulations are working, as none of them have an inbuilt cycle of review, and they all do affect localised food systems. So there are very stringent rules affecting the ability of home producers to share their dairy, meat, and poultry products through sale or barter. So living on land and growing food is already a highly regulated and bureaucratized lifestyle that some of us choose to engage in, not always realizing before we jump in just how much paperwork is involved. The draft regulations introduce berries, leafy vegetables, and melons into that regulatory system. So, what will be new? There will be a requirement that berry producers have a food safety plan and notify biosecurity that they are intending to, or that they do already produce or process berries. Some berry producers will also need to go through an accreditation system. A food safety plan and accreditation will be required for all producers of leafy vegetables and melons. A public register will be created of people and businesses who are accredited and the terms of their accreditation. An auditing process, which the draft regulations say must occur at least every year, will be introduced for all accredited producers. There will be fees payable annually and initially for accreditation. There will also be additional costs of activities that will be required in order to become accredited and penalties for failing to comply with the regulations. So if we look at the purpose and the background of the regulatory system, each of these new elements should be justified on the basis that they will support the aim of ensuring that primary produce is fit for human consumption. The supporting documents don't really contain that justification for the particular approach that is being proposed. The elements here that are actually required in the national standards are notification of berry production or processing and the development of a food safety plan to support compliance with the standards for berry, leafy vegetable and melon producers. All of the remaining elements are therefore up for negotiation. As an aside, while the national standards were created 2 years ago through a consultation process, they are not unproblematic. Requiring leafy vegetable growers to fill in forms or berry growers to notify authorities are not of themselves going to make food safer. Nor is there a compelling argument that growers are putting consumers at risk through unsafe growing practices. The only berry-related scare in Australia this year is the revelation that people are eating more berries than the rules about the use of biocides assumed. And so some Australians have been exposed to unsafe levels of pesticide poison, and so the rules have changed. The only leafy vegetable and melon related issues have come from large conventional farms and produce sold to supermarkets. The regulations will not affect food safety in those contexts. because supermarket suppliers are already signed up to industry accreditation systems and will be exempt from these new regulations. So if you're accredited under a global food safety initiative called a GFSI, that's a benchmarked scheme that will be accepted as evidence. So you being accredited under that will be accepted as accreditation under the new food safety schemes. That accreditation, and there are a number of different ones, and that's detail also that hasn't been finalised at this point of the process. But that accreditation is required by large retailers like supermarkets and export markets. So the new regulations are not going to affect the producers who are supplying those large food markets. They're only going to apply to the smaller end of the production world. And this is a really important fact to keep in mind when evaluating this proposed system. So, the draft regulations have been published along with supporting information to enable people to make submissions. There are 4 proposed forms that are quite instructive in understanding the way the regulations might be implemented. And feedback is also sought about these forms. So if you're going to be affected, I really recommend you read the forms and provide feedback. They are quite long and convoluted, but they're also going to have an impact on what you do. The explanatory paper and biosecurity webpage contain helpful and revealing information, and further details have been added during the already very short consultation period following the government's indication that they intend to develop a tiered system. And 2 examples have been referred to, the Victorian regulations and the Tasmanian egg regulations. The Victorian system mirrors the proposals in the current draft Tasmanian regulations. So there's that exemption from GFSI accredited producers, but otherwise almost everybody falls within the regulations. The Tasmanian egg regulations grant exemption from the scheme to those who produce up to 20 cartons of eggs per week and occasionally sell or supply direct to friends or family. So that is defined as home egg production. The next tier is that there is a traceability through a stamp requirement for producers of up to 20 cartons of eggs per week who sell other than direct to consumer. And then there is an accreditation system for producers of over that number of eggs per week. It's really not clear why a tiered system was not the starting point for the new draft regulations. Those examples are only one, really only some examples of a tiered system, and they're not necessarily appropriate for leafy vegetables, melons, or berries. So essentially, Tasmanians have been invited to make submissions that suggest how the system ought to look. And so, questions that we can ask ourselves is, should the tiers be based on how much you sell, the total value of the sales that you make, the size of the land that you are using to produce the food, to whom you're selling it? So should the distinction be whether you're selling direct or you're selling wholesale, or some other criteria? So it would be really helpful if you share your thoughts with government about what the tiered system ought to look like. The regulations seek to establish food safety schemes to these categories of produce. So fresh berries, and the regulations limit that to berries from the genus Rubus. So that's your raspberries, blackberries, Logans, Tays, Sylvans, etc., blueberries and strawberries. Baby leaves, leafy herbs, and lettuce. So leafy vegetables include leafy herbs like parsley, chives, and coriander, and fresh melons, which are not really a big industry in cool climate Tasmania. There are some issues that I've identified with the definitions in the draft regulations because they are inconsistent with the national standards. So the standards in some respects define the produce more broadly and in others restrict the meaning. So for example, the standards explicitly apply only to leafy vegetables that are intended to be consumed raw, and that language is missing from the draft regulations. Now, the consultation paper that accompanies the draft regulations uses the definitions in the standards and also explicitly says the definitions in the regulations are consistent. So that suggests to me that this is actually a mistake in drafting the definitions in the regulations, and they were not intended to depart from the definitions in the standards. Okay, so which activities that you might engage in are captured by the regulations? So the primary production activities around berries, leafy vegetables, or melons, as defined when they finalise what the definitions are. So primary production activities are defined in the regulations. So they are going to include, after harvest, sorting, grading, trimming, cutting, treating, freezing, packing, refrigerating, storing, washing, or combining, growing, cultivating, picking, or harvesting, horticulture produce processing, so all those first things I mentioned, when it's done at the same time as the growing, cultivating, picking, or harvesting, transport or delivery, decontamination, soaking, germinating or growing plants, harvesting, washing, drying, or packing. So if you do any of these things, the food safety schemes could apply to you. Now, again, there are some inconsistencies between the Tasmanian draft regulations and the standards. The draft regulations expand activities from those in the standards. The standards explicitly exclude freezing of primary produce from the scope of the standards, as they are intended to apply only to fresh produce. And none of the standards include germination of primary produce within the meaning of horticulture produce production. So this inclusion effectively extends the Tasmanian regulatory scheme to people who germinate herb and vegetable seeds or propagate berry plants, then sell the plants to others. So they're captured by these draft regulations, but they're not in fact captured by the relevant standards. Who do the regulations apply to? If you are engaged in home horticulture, the food safety scheme does not apply to you. If your activity falls outside home horticulture, then the regulations apply to you. Home horticulture is defined extremely narrowly, far more narrow, for example, than the definition I talked about earlier for home egg production. So producing for your own household and giving away in a private setting is exempt from the food safety schemes. But the people you're giving it away to could not use your produce in a commercial food business. So if you're a home or lifestyle grower of berries, leafy vegetables, including fresh herbs or melons, and you sell any amount direct to customers, for example, at a roadside stall, outside your property, or on social media. If you supply your produce to a food business, for example, you give your berries to a jam maker or a chocolatier, you provide your leafy vegetables to a cafe or a restaurant or a catering business, or you supply to a horticulture produce business, you go to a farmer's market, or you supply to a retail or wholesaler. If you do any of those things, you are not conducting a home horticulture activity, and the relevant food safety schemes will apply to you. Now, to clarify what supplying a food business, for example, means, the Act under which the regulations are proposed to be made, defines supply in section 4 as including deliver, sell, trade, give, or distribute, whether for valuable consideration or not. So, therefore, bartering and giving away produce to a food business or direct to customers at a market is not exempt from the food safety schemes. Selling small amounts of excess produce at your farm gate to help cover some of the costs of producing that food, but not for profit, is not exempt from the food safety schemes. So we're looking at an extremely broad reach that these draft regulations have into the activities of growing food. Okay, so now let's have a look at what happens if you're one of the many people who grow berries outside that narrow definition of home horticulture. So you need to do some things. Everybody needs to comply with standard 4.2.7, which is the national standard applying to the production and processing of berries. Now, if you're not required to be accredited under another food safety scheme, then you have to make appropriate arrangements for your context to comply with the requirements of the Act and the food safety scheme, and then you need to comply with notification requirements under the regulations. However, if you produce berries and you're also required to be accredited under a food safety scheme, then you're going to, in addition, need to be required to be accredited under the berries food safety scheme. So what does this mean? It means if the only high-risk primary produce that you produce is berries, then you do not need to be accredited. You do need to comply with the standards, the Act, and the food safety scheme as they apply to you, and notify the government that you're that you're producing or processing berries. A berry producer who is required to be accredited under another food safety scheme, for example, the schemes applying to leafy vegetables, melons, eggs, meat, dairy, or pet food, will also need to be accredited under the berries food safety scheme. So there's really no explanation in the documentation about why this distinction has been drawn. And so to explain what it means that a large-scale monocropping berry producer will not have to be accredited, but a market gardener who also grows a few berries and offers berries for sale will need to be accredited separately under each relevant food safety scheme. So similarly, a berry farmer who also keeps chickens and sells more than 20 cartons of eggs a week would need to be accredited under both schemes. So it's not at all clear why that kind of mixed enterprise is being treated as inherently more risky to public health than a large-scale monocropping berry producer. Okay, so first we're going to look at what standard 4.2.7 actually requires, and remember all berry producers other than home horticulture producers need to comply with these standards. So you have to notify the relevant authority of who you are, how to contact you, and the description of the activities you're engaging in and where you're engaging in them. So this creates an ongoing form-filling obligation, particularly for people who are occasional sellers of berries, who are not sure what activities they'll be engaged in as they manage their business. There's this onerous obligation to tell the authorities exactly what you're doing. Traceability is a slightly interesting one. I think there's room for clarification about what these standards actually intend to require, because are the standards really envisaging that individual consumers of berries from a roadside stall need to be asked to provide identity documentation before they take a punnet? You know, as a person with a roadside fridge, I do not want to be obliged to handle customers' private information. That triggers far too many legal obligations for me. I don't want to do that. So the wording could be clearer and require only that the place of sale be identified. So that would arguably be a sensible interpretation. So those of us who only sell direct to consumer have adequate traceability for our context. But I think there's a lack of clarity there that could be provided. Now, berry producers must also, according to the standards, take all reasonable measures to ensure that their berries are not made unacceptable by any inputs that they're using in their horticultural practice, by the way they keep their premises and equipment, and the health and hygiene of people who work in their business and visitors to their farm. So, on its face, reasonable measures allows for tailored expectations to suit the context of the producer or processor. But a really important question is by whose evaluation measures taken by a producer will be assessed as reasonable or not. The application of the standards is largely dependent upon the assessment of people who are placed in positions of power by the state regulations. So in Tasmania's case, this will be biosecurity officers. Where is the assurance that they're going to be appropriately educated and informed about a range of legitimate and safe growing methods and contexts? If they only understand the large commercial context, which for berries is hydroponic monocropping under polytunnels in a high input and biocide system, then how well are those people, if that's the only context they understand, how well suited are they to support soil-based organic growers who nurture a complex ecosystem and work with nature, not against it? They operate in completely different paradigms of food production. And I think fairly, many farmers are concerned about inappropriate expectations being placed upon them from people who do not understand their context or the evidence behind it. And there is a tendency to require people using natural methods to prove things that other growers perhaps aren't put to those tests. So that's a risk. The standards also require that the people who are working in that production and processing have some fairly basic knowledge and skills in food safety and food hygiene, and that you're not going to supply or sell unacceptable berries. I think it's really important to note that unless I've missed something, there is no evidence that berry producers or processors in Tasmania have failed to meet these standards. The only public health issues relating to berries have been hepatitis from frozen berries imported from overseas and the identification of unsafe levels of pesticide residue in mainland blueberries. No issues have been recorded with locally produced berries in Tasmania, and there's certainly no evidence provided to accompany these draft regulations. So that's what the standards require. So shifting now to looking at what the draft regulations, how they implement that. So Regulation 17 provides for the appropriate notification process in Tasmania as a way of implementing the standards. So it's who you are, what your business name and address is, where all the activities are undertaken, and what activities are undertaken, and then you have to notify the chief inspector of any change to the above. So that mirrors what is required in the standards. Any berry grower who fails to notify is at risk of a fine of $205 for an individual and $1,025 for a body corporate at current rates, but that'll increase. I'll talk about fees later. Notifying producers are also required to comply with traceability and reasonable measures requirements as set out in the standards to ensure that their berries are safe for human consumption, but they don't need to become accredited or undergo audits. An important thing to note is that the draft notification template that's been provided to accompany this consultation process, that template invites far more information than the matters about which notification is actually required. So these additional parts of the form are not compulsory. I think the fact that they've been included in the form indicates some desire to scrutinise and quasi-audit berry producers, even though they're not required to be accredited. Okay, so quickly looking at accreditation, because it's only required for producers who are required to be accredited for something else. As I mentioned before, the need for this accredited category of berry producer is not explained at all. So you have to make appropriate arrangements to comply with the things you have to comply with, prepare and implement a food safety program, be audited at least once every 12 months, and also your accreditation details will be included in a public register. Now, the berry standards themselves, so those national standards, do not require that Tasmania implements an accreditation system, that it conduct annual audits, or that it establish a public register. It's also not clear how these activities are necessary to ensure the food safety of Tasmanians. These are processes that are empowered in the Governing Act, but they're not processes that are required by the standards themselves. So, to finish up on berries, if the berry food safety scheme simply required notification by any berry producer, regardless of what else they produce, and that they comply with the standards, then the berry standards would be implemented in Tasmania. Okay, now let's have a look at the leafy vegetable proposals. Essentially, the same scheme is proposed for melons, which are rarely produced successfully in Tasmania because of our climate, so I'm not going to speak separately about melons. Okay, so if the food safety scheme applies to you, you must comply with Standard Food 4.2.8 and you must also be accredited. So producers and processors of leafy vegetables must all comply with the standards and participate in the accreditation system. There's no notification option or tiered system beyond the exclusion of the extremely limited home horticulture. However, remember the government has backtracked during the consultation process and said it is open to implementing a tiered system, which is why it is really important that as many people as possible tell them what you think that system should look like. But first, let's look at what the standards require in relation to leafy vegetables, because all producers must comply with them. So the standards require that producers create a food safety management statement, operate according to their statement, and have systems in place for ongoing improvement. One way of implementing this is to focus on form filling. Compliance in form is not necessarily compliance in substance. Another way of implementing it is to offer friendly support and education with a focus on substance and trust. The traceability requirements are the same, and the same questions arise as for berries around the reasonableness of traceability of individual customers of direct consumer sales. There are 7 reasonable measures requirements in the leafy vegetables standards. So we're looking at all of the inputs you're using in your horticultural practice, the growing site, premises and equipment, the temperature of your harvested vegetables, the washing and sanitization processes that you might adopt, your management of animals, vermin and pests, and the health and hygiene of personnel and visitors. The standards require that producers and processors of leafy vegetables that are intended to be eaten raw must be cleaned before supply. Otherwise, what are reasonable measures is open to interpretation and contextualisation. And as I've already spoken about, this could be good or bad for food producers, depending upon the interpretation favoured by the people evaluating the reasonableness of their measures. So again, your view might depend upon the degree of confidence that you have in the way the power of authorities might be exercised in implementation. The standard 4.2.8 also requires appropriate knowledge and skills in food safety and hygiene, and that you don't sell or supply unacceptable leafy vegetables. And again, there is no evidence that market gardeners in Tasmania are failing to meet these national standards. There have been leafy vegetable recalls, all from large and or mainland producers who sell through supermarkets, who, remember, are not going to be affected by this scheme. So essentially, the rigid and onerous regulations that the Tasmanian government has proposed appear to be a solution looking for a problem to solve. They go well beyond the requirements of the standards. They are arguably out of proportion to the risk that they're trying to manage, because of the lack of evidence that small and medium producers have failed to keep consumers safe. We don't have a major public health crisis around this. All producers of leafy vegetables must be accredited according to the draft regulations. So they need to make appropriate arrangements to comply, prepare and implement a food safety program, be audited at least once every 12 months, and their names will be on a public register. This accreditation scheme has extremely broad application. It's proposed to apply to everyone producing or processing leafy vegetables, which includes herbs, and who do not grow exclusively for their own household and to give away to friends and family. So it's going to apply to everyone, from the person who offers a few lettuces for sale in their roadside stall to the commercial producer who exports their produce to the mainland and does not have Global Food Safety Initiative accreditation. That's a lot of people. The cost of annually auditing each of these producers for the government, let alone for the producers themselves, is going to be huge. None of the consultation documents address the issue of resourcing and budgeting by the Tasmanian government. So if public service resources are not allocated, and desk audits only are conducted, even if there's resourcing for them, then the regulatory system is in danger of becoming pointless paperwork, burdensome bureaucracy that nobody reads. And this is a real risk given the financial challenges faced by the Tasmanian government and its priority to spend money elsewhere. But while we're talking about money, let's look at the costs of this proposed regulatory system for people to whom the system applies. Anyone who is required to be accredited under a food safety scheme must pay the applicable fees. So fees are payable for each applicable food safety scheme. So mixed enterprise small producers may find themselves liable to multiple schemes and fees unless an exemption is granted. There are no automatic fee exemptions in the draft regulations, but there is scope for exemptions to be granted. So the Chief Inspector may exempt a person or a class of people from liability to pay all or part of a fee where they're exporting overseas, where they're attached to a registered food business carried out by the same person at the same premises, They're an Aboriginal person engaging in production activity of traditional or cultural significance within the Tasmanian Aboriginal community. They hold accreditation under two or more food safety schemes, or they're conducting their horticulture business primarily for charitable, educational, or other non-commercial purposes. So that's going to affect your community gardens, your kitchen gardens in schools, that sort of thing, or exceptional circumstances. But remember, none of these exemptions are automatic. This approach makes more work for the regulator and greater uncertainty for people who'd like to grow some food. Automatic exemptions would not make more work. They would make it clear and easy to understand and less paperwork to be processed. What are the fees? So these amounts are based on the current fee unit, which will rise with inflation. So all of these fees will be additional costs of production that the people affected are not currently exposed to. So there's an initial application for accreditation. If you want to vary your accreditation, there'll be a fee. If you want to transfer it, there'll be a fee. And then there'll be annual fees. And this is the only tiered element in the system at the moment, which is that depending on how many people are working in your business, the fees will vary. And then there's a possibility that if you default in your accreditation, that there'll be a penalty imposed for that. Many of the producers who will be affected by the regulations are making a loss from their horticultural activities. They might just be somebody who's grew a few extra berries or leafy vegetables, and so they're just selling their excess. They might be engaging in growing as a hobby, where any sales help them cover some of the costs of production. Among growers who are trying to make a viable business, many are not paying themselves at all, or are paying themselves below minimum wage, or are making very modest livings. So these fees will make a significant impact upon many people who may therefore choose to no longer make their produce available to other humans. And this is going to have a negative impact on the Tasmanian food system. There are significant costs of time and money likely to be imposed upon growers to comply with the regulations beyond fees. The process of accreditation itself requires completion of a complicated 30-page document. It's not clear to me how much effort will be put into overcoming the obvious equity issues raised by requiring people who grow food to engage with this level of complex bureaucracy. The draft notification and food safety management statement documents contain questions which raise potential additional costs for producers. They ask questions about tests that are done to water, seeds, soil, compost, biofertilizers, soil conditioners, and other inputs. It's not clear whether laboratory testing of these things would be required. It's not clear how often they would be expected to be occurring, but all are quite possible. And this is a concern for people who practice closed loop horticulture where possible, which is the most sustainable way to grow. They might make their own compost, brew biofertilizers on farm, use on-farm water supplies and not town water. Those kinds of systems are future-proofing and sustainable food production methods. They're not inherently dangerous. People are not trying to put out dodgy food that's going to make people sick. These ways of growing are how Tasmania can achieve food security, not a system that prefers reliance on big ag and commercially available products. The people who are going to be most detrimentally affected by these additional costs are the people least likely to be in a position to be able to afford them. There's also a risk of being fined substantial penalties for non-compliance with the regulations. And again, these penalty units will increase with inflation. These punitive measures will scare many people away from food production. And is that really what we want in the Tasmanian community? Do we want to discourage people from growing vegetables and fruit? Okay, so there are transitional arrangements. This is not going to suddenly happen. So accreditation is going to be required from mid-2026. Anybody who happens to already be in business on the 30th of June 2026 won't have to pay that $600 odd accreditation fee. Then there's going to be 12 months of a transition period focused on education, helping people to comply, working out which industry accreditation schemes will be recognised and treated as accreditation under the Tasmanian scheme. And then from the 1st of July 2027, it's proposed that the regulations will be actively enforced, the penalties will be enforced, the fees will be enforced from then. It's really not clear to me why an educational and facilitating compliance approach could not be taken long term rather than switching to a punitive and costly auditing approach. New producers are going to face costly barriers to entry after the 30th of June 2026. This is likely to discourage small food production and the next generation of farmers. There are already significant financial and land access barriers for young people to enter the food production system. And is it really good policy to create more red tape and financial roadblocks? Supportive educational and enabling approaches are a legitimate way to regulate. And you might restrict penalties to the most egregious actions or inactions that endanger the public. To wrap up, I want to mention a few key things to consider. It is essential that the regulations are fit for purpose to meet the needs of small, medium, and not-for-profit horticulture producers. These draft regulations are likely to discourage and impede medium and small commercial growers. This means less high-quality, locally produced fresh food available to Tasmanians. I define the not-for-profit food producer sector to include charitable food production, but also home-scale food production, where produce is sold to cover some of the costs of production or shared with members of the community, given to other cottage industries, not as a commercial income earning venture, but still perhaps involving monetary exchange. But remember, if I'm growing berries and I'm producing them to someone who's conducting a small cottage industry, that's not home horticulture, even if I'm giving it away to them or bartering it for some of their product back. These regulations would seem to be likely to have a detrimental impact on community sufficiency, food security for Tasmanians, tourism, such as field to plate, restaurants, roadside stalls that visitors really enjoy visiting, and it's going to increase food wastage if people are deterred from making their food available to other people. So essentially, the definition of home horticulture encourages self-sufficiency and discourages community sufficiency. It's actually very difficult to grow only enough food for your own household. I suspect that the people who drafted these regulations have completely underestimated the significant role that informal food systems play in Tasmanian life, particularly in rural areas. A great deal of food is produced in a not-for-profit context, even where a few dollars are requested in exchange for a punnet of berries or a lettuce or a bunch of herbs. For-profit regulation should not apply to food produced in these systems, as it either discourages or quasi-criminalises community building behaviour. The Tasmanian way of life is built on a strong rural and regional community, cottage industry, and sharing of resources within localised areas. And these regulations are going to impede that lifestyle, which many of us treasure and that visitors to Tasmania come to experience. I do think that these regulations appear to be overreach, and I think that there is a danger they're going to feed anti-government sentiment. So growing anti-government sentiment is a problem for all of us in the democratic system. Government overreach is only going to feed those views. I'm a little bit surprised that the current Tasmanian government, who talks a lot about reducing red tape and barriers to small enterprise, have proposed such a complicated and onerous regulatory system. So how else could the standards be implemented? Education and support to comply is a legitimate approach to regulating national standards. I would argue that this would be a far better approach to managing the risk of foodborne illnesses from leafy vegetables, berries, and melons than what is proposed in this draft. The extremely narrow definition of home horticulture could be broadened and automatic exemptions built into the system. I'm not convinced that requiring written plans is equitable or actually necessarily supportive of food safety behaviour. However, those requirements are already embedded in the standards, so they probably can't be avoided at this point of the process. So that's another argument to make to challenge the national standards themselves. There is opportunity to minimise the paperwork required to satisfy the standards through notification plus confirmation that there's a food safety plan for all system categories. Good regulatory practice builds a cycle of review and consultation about how well the system is working. This could be included instead of the costly and unnecessary 12 monthly auditing of everybody who grows leafy vegetables and sells a few leaves. I'd really encourage you to share your own opinion. That slide has the link to how to make a submission. Submissions close at 5 p.m. on the 19th of December 2025. It's a really short consultation period. I wish it was longer, but that's where we're at. These regulations will need to be tabled in Parliament, and members of Parliament will have an opportunity to pass a motion to disallow them. So you may wish to contact your local member with your feedback. The minister in charge of these regulations is Gavin Pearce, so you could contact him also to share your opinions. While the initial consultation period was extended by 2 weeks to the 19th of December, a further extension could be requested because it's very important that the needs of the not-for-profit and the community affected by these regulations is heard, not just commercial industry bodies. Please feel free to share this presentation with anyone who might be interested. Thanks for getting to the end. And I hope that this was helpful.